Welcome to our afternoon session titled Succeeding in College with a Major Mental Illness, a Developmental Framework for Negotiating Transitions, Academic Demands, Leaves of Absence, Psychiatric Hospitalizations, and Reasonable Accommodations. This afternoon session, we will go until 5:30, and we will take a half an hour break from 3:15 to 3:45. I will be moderating the session with my colleague, Louise Dowse. The way the session is going to work is that we have a large number of panelists. We were going to rent out the USC football stadium for this session, but we thought we'd try to do it at Town and Gown. And the idea is actually to take a look at a student moving through the system from admission through a leave of absence and back, and the challenges and the opportunities that arise in that process. And we wanted to get as many of the folks as we could who would fit on the stage, who could talk about their role in that process. So we will be going back and forth. And as we call on each of you to speak, we're going to ask you to say, just in a nutshell, something about what it is that you do, just so everyone will get familiar with all of you as the afternoon goes on. So that is how we will proceed.
And I'm Louise Dowse. I'm from The Ohio State University. In my roles there, I was the Counseling Center Director for about 22 years, and in the last 5 years, I was an Assistant Vice President. The units in my area were counseling, health, mental health, disability services, student advocacy, judicial services, and a few others. So my experience is really overseeing the trying to get that interlocking group of support systems that I believe Elizabeth Guy talked about. Our process is going to be fairly organic and fluid. We're not looking for solutions. We're really trying to get a sense of all of the different players. We want to build a community of support, which is by building trust. And trust doesn't always exist among all of the units. Trust doesn't exist between our units and our students. We're really wanting to talk about the interface of systems and individuals. So although we're talking about an individual journey, this is not just about what the student needs to do. It's much more about what our institutions need to do as we interface with the students. Themes that I think will emerge are themes we've already heard from the last panel, themes of power, privilege, oppression, marginalization, stigma, and then I think in the context sometimes of fear and how fear feeds into the systems that sometimes leads to really bad outcomes and sometimes can be, as we recognize fear, look to how we make more positive outcomes. And with that as sort of a context of what we're going to do, I have never moderated a panel of 15 people before. And I am looking forward to a rich afternoon where we're really just putting things on the table. We're not going to try to resolve things or come up with the right solution or the best solution. We're actually going to start before you're admitted to college. We're going to start with when you apply. What does the application form say, and how does that impact? And we've asked one person to be the lead on each of these questions, but then other people will speak. So, Catherine, I wonder if you could speak to the application process.
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Harrington. I'm the Chief Enrollment Officer here at USC. Speaking about undergraduate admission for the moment, the college application process, as many of you know, is just fraught with all kinds of anxiety. That is in large part because of the ridiculously competitive environment for admission to the top 25 or 30 colleges and top universities in the country. The fact of the matter is, Stanford in this admission cycle will admit less than 5% of the people who apply. USC will admit less than 20% of the people who apply. But more than 80% of the colleges and universities in this country admit more than half of the people who apply. So in fact, there is not a shortage of higher education in this country. There is simply way more demand than the top 25 or 30 colleges and the top 25 or 30 universities can really supply. Regardless of that, the anxiety continues unabated. And for a student with a major mental illness, that anxiety is further complicated by the perhaps obvious question, but I think the answer is not at all obvious, and that is, do I reveal my illness in the application process? So I think I've outlined the issues. Have I, Louise, done an okay job there? And see if any...
And let me say there are some applications where they ask, do you have a major mental illness? And some applications that don't.
USC's does not.
But it's a variety. And then sometimes there are essays. And what do you say in the essay? Who else would like to speak to the application process? Becky?
So,
introduce yourself.
I'm Becky Child. I'm with the Learn Network, which is lived experience and research networking, or network. I get that mixed up sometimes. And I'm also a graduate student, doctoral student at Portland State University in social work and social research. And when I've had mental health issues since I was in my, since I was a kid, basically, but never got formal help until I was in college, and got a lot of help from the college counseling center. So putting it in my application was never, it didn't even come up for me as an issue. However, when I applied to graduate school, and I did my MSW at Portland State as well, I was already out and about because I've been doing mental health advocacy in Oregon for 10 years at that point. And so people who knew me, and I was pretty well known in the community, I could not say anything about it because that's kind of what my experience was based on, was doing mental health advocacy. But that said, my first encounter in a class, I had took a social justice class, and we had an assignment where we were supposed to bring things from our culture to share with our classmates. And so I talked about being homeless in my group, and one of the women in my group said to me, I'm not very comfortable around mentally ill people. And my mouth just kind of dropped to the floor. I didn't know what to say to that. And later on that same day in that same class, we were talking about the stories that people tell and why they tell some of them and not all of them. And this same person raises her hand, and she says, well, I just had somebody in my office today, and she worked in adult protective services in another county. And she says, you have to be careful of those people with schizophrenia. And when I don't know what to do, my favorite fallback is cynicism and sarcasm. And I was really disappointed that the instructors didn't address anything. It was taught by two people. And so I was just mortified at what she had said. And so I raised my hand and I just said, yeah, they have these, she talked about this woman had nearly burnt her apartment down. I said, yeah, they have these devices that they use for people with cognitive disabilities and Alzheimer's kind of thing that turns your stove off after 5 minutes, but they don't work for people with schizophrenia. And so that was kind of my introduction into the School of Social Work. So,
Tim, you want to say something?
Yeah, I can speak to my experience.
I'm going to introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Timothy Kelly. I'm also with the Lived Experience Research Network, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Iowa. When I first applied as an undergraduate student to college, I was 19. By then, I had already been in the mental health system and came out of the foster care system. So I was not a student who got to college and then had an experience. I came into college already with a diagnosis and a history. And so I think an important question on this is the question of what is the expectation for someone with a particular kind of history? And in my case, it was multiple hospitalizations for psychosis. I had been in the juvenile justice system. I had been in the foster care system. And there's a certain set of expectations about a person with that particular history coming in. And I think it's sad, but true if we think about the statistics around those sets of experiences, that a lot of people actually just self-select out of the process altogether. And part of the reason why that happens, I think, is because of, unfortunately, the expectations that are set out for prospective applicants by mental health professionals, by individuals who are part of the admissions process, and so forth. In my experience, disclosure really wasn't a choice for me when I initially applied, and that was because in order to have my tuition covered in Tennessee, where I lived at the time, admission, we got a stipend as a student with a disability, and there was no other way I was going to pay for that. At the time, I was living in a public housing projects with my mom in Nashville, and so there wasn't a lot of financial resources for school. So on the one hand, it was good that was available to me, but on the other hand, it meant that I was going to have to disclose that. And then the other part of it too, in terms of disclosure, at the time, I was on quite a lot of a medication called Zyprexa, and I gained quite a bit of weight. There's some pretty significant side effects associated with Zyprexa that I think a lot of people actually mistake the side effects of medications for features of, in this case, schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And so in a sense, like visibility gets kind of murky in there. And so my experience coming in was one of social isolation. At the time, I had gained 75 pounds on Zyprexa. Of course, I can't recall which company makes Zyprexa, but they later settled a class action lawsuit because in their trials they actually covered up that they actually knew that this was a problem. Obesity, also diabetes, and some other health problems that are pretty substantially associated with the effects of those medications. And so that was kind of my experience coming in. I felt that everybody already knew. I didn't really make a lot of friends.
Tim?
Yes.
Let me ask, because you've said that a couple times, and pick it up something Becky said. You said people already knew. And for each of you, you said, disclosure for us really wasn't an issue. If you had a colleague who came to you and said, I'm applying to school, I have this history, should I put it? And then I'm going to ask you to comment on their response. What would you tell your colleague?
Thanks, pal.
Well, that's a complicated question, and really that's an individual decision. Every context is going to be different. What I would say is, personally, my personal view is, there's a lot of risk associated with disclosure. Really substantial risk. You can put your future professional career at risk. It's quite likely that your peers and unfortunately even faculty at sometimes or others part of the university community may not have favorable attitudes towards you. And so those are all significant risks. However, what I would say on the positive side is two things, and one of them is the opportunity for social support among others who have shared experiences, which has been really the key for me in my own kind of process of wellness. And then the other thing that I would say is that the more people that disclose, the safer it's going to be for others to disclose. And the last comment on that I would say is, we know in terms of stigma, the most effective strategy from the stigma research in terms of combating stigma is really opportunities to interact with individuals, everyday kind of individuals, other students, faculty members in your department who are disclosed, because then people see that and they go, well, I knew that guy Tim, and you know, he seemed okay, so maybe other people that have schizophrenia spectrum diagnosis are okay.
Becky, do you have a thought?
I do, and I say it really depends on the context. Learn operates some listservs around for people who are in school. We have them at the graduate level, the bachelor level, and postdoc as well. And this is a topic that's constantly up for discussion on the graduate level listserv. And we haven't come up with a solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all or a checklist, do this, this, and this, and then everything will be fine. Because disclosing may be fine initially, and then something happens later on. And so there's really no set way to tell people. You just have to use your best decision at the time.
I'm going to go to Dr. Harrington, and then we're going to go to Mr. Price.
Well, I think what's been said is exactly correct. There's likely a non-trivial amount of risk associated with disclosing in the admission application. I would say, B, that not disclosing a mental illness in the application process does not prevent an enrolled student necessarily from disclosing once they're enrolled and or from accessing support resources that are available. If and when a student is in a situation where disclosing the illness can help explain something in the academic transcript, like after I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder late in my sophomore year and got on medication, my grades improved, but my grades in the freshman and sophomore year of high school were not good. And the other thing I would say is certainly both at the graduate and the undergraduate level, that one can do some work and potentially find out what the orientation of the institution is towards people with mental illness. Talk to the dean of admission, talk to the dean of the graduate school, talk to the dean of student services, have a friend talk to them, find out what kind of support and other services are available at the school. I would urge a student trying to make that decision to try and gather enough information to judge the level of tolerance and support that the institution may have, and to factor that into the decision-making process as well.
Before we go to Mr. Price, I just want to tag two themes that I want to make sure we get to. Tim, you said disclosing can open up peer supports. So I want to learn more about those and what supports the schools have in place. And you mentioned, Dr. Harrington, unexplained aspects of one's transcript or maybe a gap in a CV and how we deal with those. So I just want to tag those two as things. Jim Price, you're one of the country's leading experts on the Americans with Disability Act as it applies to mental disabilities. Could you tell us a little bit about your work and then respond?
Sure. I'm Jim Price. I'm the Executive Director of Mental Health Advocacy Services, which is a public interest law firm here in Los Angeles. I also am a lecturer in law here at the USC Law School. I think the issue of disclosure is incredibly important. It's sort of the key issue I think we have to wrestle with. But I think we're doing it in the wrong context. Applications is not a place for disclosure. The law actually protects the application process from the need to disclose. In 1973, in the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, and then in 1990 in the Americans with Disabilities Act, Congress said, you can't base your decision whether to admit somebody into your school based upon their disability. To ask a question, do you have a disability, would be inappropriate and potentially illegal. There might be reasons to disclose for strategic reasons, as Dr. Harrington suggested, where you need to explain something in your past and then you have to weigh it. But disclosure comes up really the next step. After you're in, you then have to decide whether you want help. under the laws I've just mentioned, you only get help if you disclose your disability. And that's really where the conversation comes up. The same points that Timothy made are true, that there's a lot of reasons to disclose or not to disclose, but I just want to make it clear that in the application process, there's really no reason to be discussing disability at all.
And that's going to be a great segue into our next section. My role is to get us from section to section. I do want to comment, though, on one thing. The discussion of labeling this as coming out reminds me of being a graduate student in the 70s coming out as a lesbian. Before 1973, people lost their jobs, they lost their homes, they were fired, they lost their children for coming out. After it began to change, it changed. The power of people coming out then changes the stigma. But it's not on just the people coming out. It's up to everyone in this room to counter stigma when you hear it, in the same way when Becky described what happened in a classroom. We have to change the culture about stigma to make it safe to disclose when we need to disclose. So that's my little preaching point. Steve.
May I want to reinforce question-asking behaviors. That's the way psychologists talk. May I read this question to Jim?
Okay.
What does that mean? I was never sure. Jim, this says, under the ADA, a school can only ask about an applicant's disability if it is believed that having a disability will conflict with what the academic programs defines as the essential skills needed to successfully get through the program. So, do colleges who do ask directly on the application believe that a person's disability will conflict with the applicant's ability to successfully attend and graduate from the program? And I think you might want to just address some of the underlying assumptions in the question.
Sure. One is disability is a reasonable thing to take into account, generally speaking, as it relates to admissions in terms of whether somebody is qualified or not. And the issue of qualification for the service is based upon, can they perform the essential functions of being a student in the program. And there's a huge amount of deference given to the school and the educators to determine what that is. I mean, we have college counsel here, but the advice would be make sure that's in writing, make sure it's clear what your essential functions are and what you're determining are the key things somebody can or can't do. But the most important piece is that in determining who's qualified, it's with or without a reasonable accommodation. And so if somebody can't do something based upon their doing it without any particular assistance or accommodation, that's not enough to say that they're not qualified for the program. There has to be consideration of that accommodation. When I spoke before and said that it's a question that really shouldn't be asked at this stage, it's because the general application process isn't really about how I think when you get into a graduate program and you're talking about an internship or something, you have a much more generalized or a much more specific idea of what those essential qualities are. For a liberal education to apply to USC, what are the essential functions that somebody, because of a diagnosis, couldn't do? I can't imagine there are any. That's why I say it's likely to be illegal. I mean, that becomes a question of fact and an argument about, is there a legitimate reason, and I can't think of one, why you would need to know if somebody had a diagnosis at the application process. Maybe in a different program, a specialized program, that might be the case. So yes, that's true. The question, it's true that universities can decide admissions based upon their essential function and their essential criteria, but those criteria generally wouldn't just involve diagnosis. Just one more quick point about discrimination in the application process is, the one standardized thing that the application process includes are standardized tests. And there's a whole body of law that's developed around those standardized tests and the accommodations that you need to be given on those tests. One of the big issues was the practice in the past of flagging those tests where extra time was given, where extra accommodation was given, and then passing that on to the school with a little bow on it saying, these people got something special. And I'd be actually interested from the admission side what you did with that little extra knowledge that these people required more time on the test. Did that mean anything to you?
And I'm actually going to move the topic
Sorry.
because that's a good question to leave on the table. I do think the questions on the application form sometimes are left over from wanting to provide services. So they weren't even put on there with the idea about mental health disability. They were put on, do you need services from a counseling center? I think we can all go home and say those questions need to come off of the application. Let's move now to the first arrival on campus, which for many students is actually when the formal orientation happens. And sometimes that's with family members. So let's talk, and let's talk a little bit about the orientation process, and we've asked Lynette to start that.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, excuse me. I work here at USC.
Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Okay, we're having...
It's coming. Keep talking.
Okay. I work here at USC in... I'll put this down.
No, it's coming.
Was it coming? Okay.
Just talk.
I'll just talk. I work in the Division of Student Affairs, and I work with a variety of different offices under an umbrella called Advocacy and Support. So it's a variety of things from disability services to an office that does the student troubleshooting and the crisis management and partners on a daily basis with psychological services and other folks on campus. I was asked to talk about or start the conversation a little bit about orientation. This morning, Dr. Gong Gai started talking about transition. And I think oftentimes for our students and our families, they first start thinking about transition when orientation occurs. And it's an interesting mix of folks at orientation. I know most universities will have something either periodically throughout the summer with a number of sessions or maybe just before school starts where they're really introducing students and their new families to a university. So a lot of it is about transition. And you're going to have a variety of folks there. You're going to have students who think, I've got this covered, I got in, that was the biggest hurdle I had to do, and now it's going to be easy street. And not realizing that maybe they might be facing challenges down the way and that they might need some services. And then you have the folks who already have that anxiety building, wondering about what this community is going to be like. I'm leaving home. I had challenges in high school. I made it here. I'm going to have more challenges there. So the conversations about transition oftentimes start around orientation. And I know here at USC recently we started having a family session for family members to start addressing transition, introducing families to the support services and resources here, letting folks know that they are utilized by a number of students, and helping family members also realize the transition process, the development process, that even though some of these resources might not be needed now, they might be needed later. Also helping folks understand the milestones that occur. When midterm grades come out, it might be the first time a student has ever received a B. They get very upset. We take people to the counseling center because this is the first time they've had a disappointment. Transition starts with orientation, but it really needs to continue throughout the university experience. But it's a place where we need to start having these conversations and helping students with acclimation.
Yes.
Were you done? Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Janet Shortle. I work as an assistant dean at Cornell University in the Office of Student and Community Support. And one thing that I would add around orientation that feels really important is I think all institutions of higher learning are very effective or very active in putting resources out to students. I think the piece that has been most effective in the Cornell context is peer education. Mm-hmm. And in the orientation, it takes a variety of forms, and maybe many of your campuses have it as well. The one that I feel really inspired by is a program called Real Students, Real Stories. And it begins with the president of the university talking about how he failed a class and how he was encountering depression in his life and why it's important to reach out. He's highly effective, and of course it's great to have a president on a film. normalizing vulnerability to first-year students and transfers. But then it goes on to feature students who have struggled at Cornell and have found the means by which to shift their lives in really powerful ways. And I don't think there's any more effective method to new students to have older students who look like they're doing just fine to hear that they were maybe also struggling. The next level is a diversity program that all first-year students are required to attend. It's a peer social justice theater troupe. And I was intrigued earlier about the question about culture and diversity, and how diversity within culture is that they do skits on a variety of experiences that they've either personally or others have experienced around bias. And they include mental illness and mental challenges in the context of talking about diversity. After they do their presentations or their skits, the whole audience starts to break into conversation about where do you connect with what you heard here today? And what I've watched over the years that we've had this program is, because they've really worked to really challenge us to think about diversity in very broad-ranging ways, from talking about cultural biases to depression to gender issues to neurological diversity issues, that the audience, it's pretty hard to be sitting there as a first-year or transfer student and not have some point of access into that discussion. So immediately, we don't have that, well, it's diversity education, has nothing to do with me, which we used to have, but more, wow, I never thought of diversity that way, quite that way. Students stand up and disclose things in front of hundreds of their peers. There's a lot of emotional sharing, and then there's a lot of public affirmation of their peers who applaud them for making themselves vulnerable in an environment that you think probably doesn't valorize that. So it's pretty sophisticated work, and of course it needs very careful care so that you don't have vulnerable students leaving a big presentation feeling unsupported afterwards. But I'm telling you, from watching these experiences, there is not a more empowering experience when peers get up and their peers applaud them.
This is also a time that you often connect with the Office of Disability Services.
Hi, I'm Barbara Blacklock from Disability Services at the University of Minnesota. And I also am the co-chair of the Provost Committee on Student Mental Health on our campus. And orientation really intersects strongly with disability services. And it starts with when a student is admitted to the university, which I think is common on many campuses. Congratulations. Please check the boxes of offices you'd like some information from. And that's the first step when students will be getting something from our office. They may not have a disability, they may have a friend who has a disability, but we send that information to them, how to access our services, how they can coordinate with our office during orientation, and also to let them know if they do have a disability, they may need to request some accommodations during orientation. One of the most common requests we get is for a private room. And often it is related to a student who has a mental illness, who there's a variety of reasons that would be reasonable, and we would make that arrangement. The other thing that happens, and we do a lot of the same things that Cornell does around orientation, but an additional one is, it's called Respect You, where students come in and a lot of resources related to diversity are in a large room. And all of those resources are doing unusual messaging to convey their message. And our Provost Committee on Student Mental Health does a message about how we all need balance in our life. And we do that by demonstrating how to balance peacock feathers on your finger. And on that peacock feather is a sticker for our campus mental health website, which has all the mental health resources on campus.
Kent,
One of the things that we do at
introduce
Cornell,
yourself.
I'm Kent Hovell. I'm a dean of students at Cornell, and by the way, I'm also a faculty member in architecture at Cornell. The dean of students is drawn from the ranks of the faculty. So in 2001, I left my role as mild-mannered university professor and became the dean of students. Little did I know that I've been in training to be the dean of students all those years, but it's been a fantastic experience for me. And one of the reasons why I'm here is because my two children presented with schizophrenia about 6 months apart, and it has affected my role and my work as a dean of students throughout. So I have a special kind of relationship to students with mental health challenges, which I've tried to use to the benefit of those kinds of students on Cornell campus. Now, with regard to families and orientation, I like to characterize our relationship to families institutionally as one of partnership. And so what we did last year for the first time is we invited about 50 faculty, staff, students, and alumni to write brief essays welcoming families to campus. And I use the term families rather than parents because at Cornell and many of our institutions, families take great pride. It's about mom and dad, but it's about sisters, brothers, aunts and uncles, grandparents, all take great pride in having their child come to Cornell. So this is really meant to be a family book that's shared amongst family members. And these are 50 really lovely articles. They're almost like a gift to new families of our parents, parents and families of our new students, welcoming them. And it's also a kind of a roadmap to the university, and it is also a handbook about student health and mental health. So it's kind of a stealth handbook, if you will. It's leavened with all kinds of information about what you might do to assure the good health of your student on campus. So any of you interested, I brought a few copies, but if you're so inclined, I'll be happy to share it with you if you'd like to replicate it in some fashion.
Jim.
Just one particular context for thinking about the importance of orientation and the work to make a student with a mental disability feel empowered to do something is for those individuals who had been identified in high school as having a disability. There's a whole different sort of set of legal requirements that the school is basically responsible for making sure whatever that child needs to benefit from an education is provided. If the school doesn't do it, they're out of compliance, and there's a whole process to get them back into compliance. Once the student graduates and moves on to post-secondary education, the school no longer has a burden, a legal burden, to actually identify anybody because of their disability or offer any particular person who doesn't ask a service. And so there's this transition from a high school student who's used to basically having themselves evaluated and the services developed that they need to being placed in a new situation where they actually have to disclose and ask to get the service. And that the importance of orientation to me is making sure that there's an environment friendly enough that they feel capable of doing that.
And I will say that my experience is not all families are as supportive of their students as we've talked about. So sometimes the experience of orientation is actually where the student and the parents diverge about what they want to have happen. Timothy wanted to talk.
Yeah, just on the issue of deciding to reach out for supportive services, and also connecting to the disclosure question also. And it was interesting what you were saying about the application process. In other words, legally you cannot ask if somebody has a disability in the process of application. And so often what institutions will do is describe in detail the tasks that a person needs to do, so that to determine whether or not the disability is going to interfere with whatever that may be. A problem that we get into with mental health concerns is that we don't really have any clear way of deciding what that's going to be for someone. So in other words, in my experience, I was considered to be permanently and completely disabled, unable to work. That's the case of many of our other graduate students in our network. And so, if at a moment in time a person is experiencing some kind of distress, we don't have a test. We don't have any clear way to determine what the person's outcome is going to be. And in fact, the research is pretty clear that a sizable number of people that have even the most grave diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, a good third of those recover to the point where they don't even require any treatment at all, including medication. That's across all of the longitudinal studies of 15 years or longer in the research literature, and that's just a fact. And so my point there in terms of disclosure is that just because a student is struggling now, doesn't mean that they're always going to be struggling. And it goes the other way too, of course. Just because somebody's well now doesn't mean at some point in their program they might struggle. And so that's an issue where I think a lot more clarity needs to be, or I guess more information needs to be provided to disability support services to be able to appropriately accommodate students.
And that's going to be a great segue into students now arrive. They arrive, they move into their residence hall, they want to fit in, they want to be like everybody else. And Heather, I think you were going to start with some comments.
So hi, I am Heather McCletchie-Leader. I am a freshman proctor at Harvard University. So I work for the freshman dean's office, and I'm in residence, which means that I live with the students. So in my experience, it's never really an issue of figuring out how to access services, because essentially that's what I'm there for, right? Like, I'm the primary point of contact for students. And so if they needed to know where to get laundry done, for instance, that would be something that they could come to me about, and I can get them connected to whatever type of service that they need. So I would say that it comes back, one, to this issue of disclosure or not, and I think that's usually connected to whether or not services are required. So accommodations in classes and on exams, that would determine whether or not people wanted to do that. And then transition was something that came up quite a few times. So, you know, the path splits again between students who are diagnosed versus students who may not be diagnosed. Those who are diagnosed are much more inclined to be thinking about this much more actively. Those who aren't diagnosed, their situation is different. And there's a little bit of difficulty thinking through this, given the variety of moving parts and the different situations that people would be in. But a big question is, do I let my roommates know? So they're concerned, again, as you said, about fitting in. So should I share this? Is it something I should keep to myself? When do I tell them? How do I tell them? How might people react? And then on the transition piece, there is the question of support networks, right? So wherever I was before I came here, maybe it was that I was diagnosed or not, but maybe people understood that I was moody and that sometimes I would need time away, time by myself. How do I build that into this new living situation with people that I don't know all that well, who aren't related to me, who may or may not be as supportive as I would hope for them to be? How do I not put too much pressure on people? How do I still seem quote unquote normal? These are the types of questions that in my experience I've seen.
The comments on those first few weeks when you arrive, what you see. Barbara.
I think reflecting on the morning speakers, the importance of our network, our web for everyone. And we have a number of opportunities that someone could be referred to a disability services office, whether it was from their RA, from their faculty member, from an advisor, from someone in the Dean of Students offices. But I think it's also really important for students with mental illness that many of those professionals are a little uncomfortable. How do I talk about that? How do I connect you to a disability services office? So I think it's really the role of disability services to do a lot of outreach on campus and to recognize that student mental health is a campus-wide issue. It's not just a disability issue, and how we all work together so that students have multiple opportunities to disclose, and also to be talking to people, and usually that would be someone in disability services, about how they might want to disclose. Do you just talk about, when you're referring to a roommate, do I just say, I have this chronic health condition, I was diagnosed in 10th grade, you're going to see some medication, and I just want you to know I'm okay? Or do I share with you that I have schizophrenia? I mean, that's a very personal decision, and that individual has to really weigh the pros and the cons on that. So I think it's, what I'd like to really underscore is the importance that all the offices on campus and also students know about disability services and that we can't just do it once at orientation. We have to keep doing it over and over because people will acquire conditions. And some person may come to college with a mental illness that's been undiagnosed, or the symptoms may have been mitigated with a lot of treatment. They come to college and it's a whole different story. So we need to constantly be educating the campus community about what's available and how to help students access those services.
Tim, you wanted to make a comment.
Just on the disclosure issue, and I think your comments were getting to this a little bit, but it's not the case that somebody just discloses once, right? It's you disclose and then you disclose again and again, or each time you also decide how much do you tell, which is kind of what was going to your point. One thing that's valuable, I think, is that we have other models to look to for this, and I think probably most usefully maybe would be like LGBTQ coming out, the identity models, right, that are related to the disclosure process. These are very useful frameworks that other communities, or in some case intersecting communities, that we can look to kind of help us understand that process and maybe to better support students.
I think there's other first generation, whether you've got any kind of role models of how to succeed at college. There's other intersecting issues that play into this adjustment in the arrival. I think Steve's going to go to a question, and then I'm going to go to Eileen. I call her Leanie, but it's Eileen, and then to Becky.
The question is, one of the most important skills that a student who has a disability needs to be successful is to know how to advocate for themselves. What is being done to teach students who have disabilities to advocate for their needs and accommodations?
Anyone want to respond to that? Barbara,
I
and then
think
Becky.
that's a role for disability services, and I really can't speak for all disability services offices throughout the country, but that really is a partnership. That disability services role is to work with the student for where they're at. Some students are really struggling with that word disability, and others come in very empowered and know exactly what they need. And so we all have processes and procedures and want to clarify with the student what part of that they can do, what part of it we can do, but it's a partnership.
Eileen?
Well, I was thinking about people...
Have you introduced yourself yet?
Oh, I'm Eileen Rosenstein. I'm the director of the Counseling Center here at USC. And we're talking about arriving here, and everyone who arrives here wants to feel like they belong, they connect, and they're going to succeed. Many people, though, come with challenges they already know about, and others come and don't know what the challenges are going to be. So one of the things that I really put stock in is reflection. That one of the things we can teach all students is how to reflect on what are our strengths and what are the areas, our trigger areas that happen. And this really has to happen at this very beginning phase. So what's interesting is many colleges are now developing courses for the first semester small cohort groups where people talk about these kind of issues. The American Health Association does a survey, College Health Survey. 42% of our students, just in general, talk about being so overwhelmed and stressed out that they can't function at times, to the point it affects their academics. And then you have a cohort group that's struggling with mental illness who has on top of the challenges. I think we have to look at our paradigm at schools, that schools aren't just about academia anymore, but it's also developing the whole person. Because to succeed, you need to be healthy enough to kind of do these challenges. So looking at arriving at school, this is a key time that schools have to look at how are we going to prepare people for all these transitions. And I think it's been interesting that many of the smaller schools are now adopting these courses that used to be targeted towards like athletes, that the whole general population would be taking to deal, and it helps people connect, feel belonging, and their purpose of why even being at the school.
Becky?
So I also want to call attention to the needs of non-traditional students. Given that a number of people with psychiatric disabilities or mental health challenges often are withdrawing from school at different times to deal with their issues and then come back, that there needs to be orientation and outreach to non-traditional students. And just going to a freshman orientation may not meet the needs of folks. And if their lives are complicated and hopefully enjoyed by having children, or how they deal with the needs of being a parent and being a student and maybe working simultaneously, that needs to be addressed too. It's not just traditional students living on campus.
I have a question for Heather. This morning we heard Michelle and Evan and Brenda, and now we have Becky and Timothy talking about the complexities of disclosure, and that's a theme that we continue to come back to. Now, you are in the dorm, and a student comes to you and says, "Do I tell my roommate?" That question would make me very anxious if I were in your position. Because, of course, you're living with these students. Your room is right there. So a lot is at stake in that question. Now, Barbara has talked about disability services as a resource. You are a resource for all of these students. Who is the resource for you? Where do you go? How do you get trained? How do you think about it when you get a question of that nature?
So that question has two pieces, right? Like, how do I get trained? And then I guess the other piece then is how do I respond, or out of what set of resources I respond, right? So in terms of how I get trained by the dean's office, right? And I'm made to understand what resources are available, how to connect people to resources, where they can go. In terms of how I respond to that question, so do I disclose or not, I don't necessarily know that my training has a whole lot to do with that, right? So for me, it's a conversation, right? And this has less to do with the ways in which, so now we're getting into Heather's opinion on things, right?
That's what we want.
And not, exactly. Not so much what the party line is on these things, right? So Heather is now speaking for Heather. And the way that I tend to deal with things is, what do you want, right? And how is the decision to disclose or not disclose going to impact those things potentially? So let's understand the system, right? Let's understand the various pieces to the extent that we can. What are the risks of disclosure? What are the risks of non-disclosure? If it's a situation where your behavior, and I think somebody raised this a little bit earlier, whether or not knowing about your diagnosis would help someone interpret what they're seeing, then maybe it's helpful to let people know what's going on. If you have a diagnosis that doesn't necessarily present within the context of your living situation, then maybe they don't need to know. What would you be comfortable with? What would you be less comfortable with? Just having conversations with people about what are you afraid of, right? Like, why would you disclose? Why wouldn't you disclose? So I guess the takeaway from a lot of what I've said is it depends, it's situational, and my response would be to deal with each student as an individual within the understood context. So the consensus reality, I guess.
Okay, so let me put a scenario out that I don't think is unlikely. A family discovers that their student is living with a crazy person. I spend a lot of money to send my student to this school. I need them to be successful, and I want you to move that student out of my student's room so my student can be can have an undisturbed path. Timothy responded first.
Yeah, I mean, on that question, I think, something to consider in this discussion about disclosure, I think, is what message do we, the royal we as a community or a society send about what these experiences are, what we think about these experiences, such that we would even have a conversation about secrecy, right? I mean, so that's a question. Now, of course, we live in a world in which there's considerable risk associated with making that choice to disclose. So I don't say that with the intention of saying one should, but just that's an important question. And then the other piece I would add is cognitive load. So there's actually evidence to suggest that a student struggling with the choice about whether or not to disclose actually makes a lot of their other tasks difficult, particularly schoolwork. Now, with respect to the answer to the question about families, I would ask this question. I would insert another, and I know earlier in the conversation there was a concern about the term minority, but minority to me means a group, whether they're the majority group, like women, for example, who nevertheless experiences inequality in society. So that's what I mean. But insert any other minority group into that question, and what would our response be? In other words, if a parent asks the university, I don't want my child living with insert minority community of your choice, what response would be the appropriate response on the part of the university?
And I think I would hope the response for that and the other responses are, A, you move the student that's causing the problem, and the student causing the problem is the one complaining. But you've also got a community harm, because this is not an isolated event. This affects the floor. This affects the residence hall. So you've got a community wound as well as an individual wound that I also think we need to respond to. Did anyone here resonate with that or have any kind of response to that?
Well, I can just say that this is not a theoretical question. It's something that the residence hall staff deal with on a regular basis, probably weekly, if not more frequently. Right. And so it is a huge challenge to deal with them. And we have to do the right thing by all concerned, not only the individuals, but the community on every floor. And as you know, that critical transitional year to college, that first year, is one in which we establish community values. And so in making that decision, we're actually articulating our values in very direct ways.
But I also don't hear you say that there is harm, right? So what you're saying is that a parent calls with a concern. It also doesn't sound like the student that belongs to the parent is calling anybody with a concern. And so I think that changes things, right? There is no harm. If there's harm, that's a different conversation to be had. But if a parent is just upset with their student's living situation, then, to that earlier point, this is where we do articulate these values.
And then you get into, and I'm going to move us on, but it's sometimes the harm is the other gossip that goes around. And any bias incident. I mean, we had a bias incident on one of our regional campuses. It was a racial bias incident. And then the student who was mouthing off to everybody about her concerns and how she was mistreated and really harmed. And she was angry at an African-American student who I can't even remember what she thought she did. That racial conflict harmed the community. This ableism harms the community. It's the other things that happen around there. And I'll let Jim have the last word on this.
And it's only to say that I think each of these instances would be create an opportunity to teach. I mean, again, people are going to the university to learn. This creates a great scenario for the institution to step in and actually have an impact. And so I'm not sure how exactly you do that. That's not my field, but I think we shouldn't miss the opportunity to actually make a positive out of the negative.
Yes.
This is probably
Janet.
going to sound a little Pollyannish, but if all of us hear about first-year parents, but talking with that first-year student who was with a roommate that he or she doesn't feel they have the resources to be with, this may be their first experience of living with someone who's manifesting a behavior set that's not familiar to them. I think a lot of us in student affairs are quick, I think rightfully, to be protective of the student who is being labeled or excluded. And I think the art of student affairs work is to honor the vulnerability of that young person, as you say, use it as a teachable moment, but it comes in a very complicated way, like adjusting to a roommate is an adjustment, and just starting right there. And when we come with different experiences, so that we put the context of, I may have a roommate, a very common example from my experience is a parent who complains that their daughter or son is sharing a room with someone who has Asperger's. And it's just disrupting her whole life, or his life. And so if you start there, you're speaking of Asperger's as if it's separate from any of the other range of challenges that might come to a student living with another student, through any number of expressions of identity. So I think we've been working pretty hard to say, remember, they're 18 or they're 20 or whatever. Let's bring the conversation down and say, what about's happening in your room? Getting those students to sit with someone and talk about what's happening in their lives, so it doesn't become the hall gossip, like, oh, I can't switch my roommate. But just as much damage happens in the process of not talking about it. But I really like putting it in the context of, for many of our students, I'm sure yours, I know my own children, they've never had to live with someone. We have a lot of kids coming to college now. I was the oldest of 7. I couldn't wait to get to college and have one roommate. But for many of our students, they want their own room from the start, and it's not for special consideration. They just don't have those skills yet.
They want their own room, they want their own bathroom, they want other things. Becky, and then I'm going to move to a little broader topic.
The other piece around telling has to do with intention. What is your intention in telling your roommate? Do you want support, or are you just telling them to deal with me, kind of thing? And to be more intentional about what you have disclosed.
And I think intentionality is also important for all of us in administrative roles. We don't let these things happen and just not respond, because we don't know what to do. I think some of the real errors happens when, as administrators, we don't know what to do, so we do nothing. I think it's important for us to be intentional about creating the values and the climate that we want to have. I'm going to move us now to just even more general adjusting to college. We haven't talked about the classroom. Does anyone want to talk about what happens in the classroom? Becky.
So I'm going to talk about as being an instructor because I'm teaching in the School of Social Work at Portland State. And I'm having my colleagues and fellow doctoral students who are asking questions around, so I have in my syllabus that says that a student can't miss more than 4 classes or they'll have to repeat the class. And then they get an accommodation saying that they can leave class when they need to, or they can miss however much they want. And so I have students who don't, they're really missing out on significant dialogue and conversation. And I'm really concerned about what they're learning or not learning in this case. And what I'm seeing is that the faculty really are at a loss around how to address the needs of the students in relation to accommodations. They don't understand the accommodations. I think it's a human tendency that if we see people doing something different, that we think they're getting away with something. And so I don't see any support coming from the administration in terms of diversity training around disability in these kinds of issues. And given that psychiatric disabilities are kind of the most frequent types of accommodations that are granted by disability service offices or provided to the student body, I would think that there needs to be some kind of training and education for faculty. And I'm even hearing some of the questions from tenured faculty. So it's not just even adjunct faculty, but it's also tenured faculty who don't know how to support students. And some of them are wanting to do the right thing, but they also are concerned about, how can I say that the student learned what they needed to learn if they've missed more than 50% of my classes?
Thank you.
I come on the scene. I'm Ron Garrett. I'm a professor of law and religion here at the University of Southern California.
Can people hear? No, Ron?
Yeah.
I'm Ron Garrett. Is my mic working? Very good. I teach both at the law school and in the college. And what I see is very uninterpreted. All I see is there's a student who has missed class for the last 3 weeks. or they weren't in class for the last 3 weeks, and they didn't turn in their assignment. So then my challenge is to create a hospitable environment beginning on day one in the classroom, where if something is going on in the student's life, they can trust me enough to respond to my overtures. At this point, I don't know what's going on. There's a possibility that the student might then come to me and share a little bit. Now, I don't ask questions, but the opportunity the faculty member has is to show care and concern for the individual student so that the student can give the professor a chance to help him or her. Now, that might mean walking the student over to the health services or otherwise facilitating a resource. I am a layperson. I can't give counseling. I need to be aware of my own limitations. But I can be a bridge, and I can give the student my affirmation as a unique human being.
Any other faculty people?
Well, as a faculty people, I think that when it comes to these issues, these are university-wide problems that need all hands on deck. You know, they need a university-wide solution. So what we've done is we've created these handbooks, which I had put out on this, out in the other room, and many of you have picked up. It's really meant to be a guide for faculty in responding to students in distress. And it was meant to do more than just be a pamphlet. It was meant to be a book which also has the yellow pages in it, which describe what faculty might see in the behavior of students who come to their offices to speak with them, to be advised, and other things. We have made this available to anybody who wants to adapt it for their own purposes. So if you have an interest in having an electronic file of this document, we're welcome to send it to you. All we can ask is that you don't use the photographs of the students, because we didn't get their permission for use beyond Cornell. But I'm sure you want to put your own students in it in any case. But if you find it useful, please don't hesitate. There's one for staff as well. And they've been well received. They're distributed every year to our new faculty and to any faculty who feel they need another copy, as well as to graduate students who are TAs.
Steve.
I just want, if I could hear for a moment, Ron talk to Jim and Barbara. Because Ron, you use 3 words, care, concern, and affirmation in your exchange with the student. And I would like to hear first Barbara and then Jim talk. When you hear a faculty member say, I don't know what's going on, I want to convey care, concern, and affirmation. What help can you give to that faculty member? And then Jim, I'd like to hear you. From your ear, are there any do's and don'ts? And then I'd like to hear Steve McDonald just talk about that as well. So.
Thank you. One of the first things that I thought of is we've done a survey on our campus with students and asked them what leads them to feel comfortable approaching a faculty member. And they said, number one, it's really helpful to see a syllabus statement in the faculty syllabus that not only just says students with disabilities, but elaborates on that. Students with mental health, ADHD, learning, physical, so that the whole broad range is aware that this could be me. So that statement is there, but what helps even more is if the faculty reads that statement, so that shows that they're really open to that conversation. And then if you were to call me and said, this student said that they were having some mental health issues and I'm not quite sure what to do, sort of like Cornell, we have a website, and I would ask you, are you in front of your computer? Yes. Would you go to this website? Does this fit any of these scenarios that we have listed about students in distress? Here's some suggestions. You can print some things off. You can give it to the student. And if the student seems like they're in imminent danger, then I would direct you, because I'm not psychological services, to psychological services to say they're here to help you, because as you said, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm caring about you, and I want to make sure that you get what you need. And I would also applaud you for making the extra call.
Okay. what I applaud is care, concern, and affirmation. I mean, that's the answer to how all faculty should treat all students. And so it goes way beyond any conversation about disability. The conversation is not about disability. It's about the person in front of you having an issue and you needing to have care, concern, and affirmation of that issue. And it could be that they're having a fight with their roommate. I mean, there's no reason to think it has anything to do with this symposium. And so the only wrong turn you would take is if you changed that care, concern, and affirmation and started making an assumption that there was a disability involved and started asking about a disability as opposed to, how can I help you? What, is there any work? And clearly what I heard Ron doing is not that. It's available to all students who have concerns in the school, in his class.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because the students are so driven and so achievement-oriented, they're likely to view having missed classes or done poorly on an assignment as an almost insurmountable obstacle. And so a way an instructor can make care, concern, and affirmation real is to reach a forward-looking agreement. Just show that nothing has happened that is insurmountable from my angle of view as your teacher, and what can we do going forward that's going to make this a constructive experience. And if you can do more than just words, if you can make that come real for the student, they kind of see it in your life and in your eye, then you can do some good work going forward.
So I'm Steve McDonald. This is Steve McDonald, General Counsel at Rhode Island School of Design, and I guess my role here is the information disclosure part. So first of all, I would applaud that you've made a space available for students to choose to disclose or not as they wish and are comfortable, and you've made them comfortable, hopefully. But from the lawyer's perspective, the question more often is when the faculty member is going to the Disability Services Office wanting to know things. And we'll talk at much more length tomorrow about the limits on that disclosure. But my response typically is, this is one of those be careful what you ask for questions, because why do you want to know? What are you going to do with that information? And once you do know it, how are you going to forget it when it comes time to make all the other important decisions that you're going to be making about that student? It will have a definite impact on the dynamics of that classroom if you've learned it from someone other than the student. And so my general reaction is, no, you don't need to know that unless the student wants to self-disclose.
I think there's also a role for us to play in fighting stigma with our colleagues. So we're hearing from faculty that are really supportive, but I still hear from faculty saying these accommodations are cheating. It is not fair to the rest of the people in my class to give more time. Of course, we could start making the argument that time tests actually have no empirical validity, but that's another topic that I'm not sure we're going to entertain here. But I think we have a lot of power when you hear a colleague make a disparaging remark, make it, not wanting to, what is this? Why do I have to take my test over? I don't have time. They don't even have parking. All the reasons that you have not to provide accommodations. How do we counter that? Because that's about changing the culture. And I think we all know at this point that changing the culture is a major take-home to make this a much more supportive, accepting part of this level of diversity. Any thoughts about that?
I like showing the research. There's research out there that says that actually extra time, which is often the accommodation given in numerous situations, actually for someone who doesn't hit an accommodation level actually worsens their grade because they go back and they recheck everything and they don't need it. So I think the question often faculty have is, how come this person needs help extra time on this and not this? And so it's also helpful for them to understand the challenges. Why does extra time make this an equal playing field for the student to show what they've learned? And I think that once they get that concept, it helps, and also to show some of the research that backs up that it's not an academic integrity issue. It's really an equal opportunity issue, which some people don't agree with.
Right, and we had that discussion about the role of privilege, not understanding what it means to be equal.
Exactly.
I think Becky and Ron, or Tim, I'm sorry, Tim.
Yeah. I was just going to make one comment, and that is that, I know we're talking about students today, but these issues affect faculty as well. And so, that's kind of a broader issue maybe, but the perceptions of faculty members who have psychiatric disabilities and members of the university community, no doubt that impacts. I mean, it's a broader sort of context of stigma that I think we're dealing with. And so, it's kind of like a lot of different approaches that need to take place. And somebody in the earlier panel mentioned microaggressions. I mean, it's a really, key kind of thing. And that's just a way of saying, those kind of like comments that are made that are kind of like make you feel uncomfortable. Like that person just said something that's kind of like stigmatizing, and so interrupting those kinds of comments, finding strategies as allies to interrupt those kind of comments is a very concrete thing that can be done. And it's safer for faculty, and I might also say that it's probably safer for students who maybe don't have psychiatric disabilities to be the one acting as allies to help interrupt those comments.
The other thing that was mentioned earlier this morning, and I think I've heard other people talk about it, is the Disability Services Office and their process of notifying instructors that students have disabilities. If what you have to do is go get this goldenrod piece of paper that is just a bright red flag for people, I know at Portland State that they send instructors individual emails, so students don't have to actually come up and talk to you about it until you approach them. And so that's one way to reduce the stigma. I mean, use the concepts of universal design in terms of how do we make our university accessible.
Jim?
I was just going to say that the concept of reasonable accommodation means that you're going to provide the accommodation that allows you then to measure the person's performance equally to the other folks whose performance is being measured. If this colleague still says, but that's not fair, then it's really a political issue. And the politics of it was decided in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act, when they, in fact, Congress said, we're going to treat people with disabilities equal and provide them the accommodations they need so they could become participating members of our society. That ship has sailed.
And that's the time, as an administrator, that I sometimes encourage my ADA coordinator, in other words, I sick Scott on them, to have a discussion with that faculty. Not that faculty person, but perhaps the dean needs to have the ADA coordinator come in and talk to the faculty. Steve, you got a question?
Well, I have two questions, one for each of the attorneys. But I want to follow up on something that Timothy said, because I thought, Timothy, what you said was so lovely. You said there are ways to interrupt microaggressions. Could you just give us an example or two of the kind of thing that you have in mind?
So, this kind of goes to the question of how does a student make a decision about whether or not to disclose to a particular faculty person. And that's a question I could give my opinion about, or I could tell you that the National Alliance on Mental Illness did a survey, and they found that one of the key reasons why students don't, in 2012, national survey, was because of stigma, right? So students are actually not disclosing because they're concerned about what people think. I mean, it seems like an obvious point. It's also an empirical finding. And so in terms of microaggressions, so you would say, well, what might a faculty person say that might cause a student to say, ooh, I probably don't want to talk to that person? It probably seems relatively obvious, maybe, comments about, in my case, comments about schizophrenics. I'm going to pay attention to those kind of comments as I'm feeling out an environment to see what kind of attitudes are present. In terms of interrupting those comments, there's strategies for that. And I think actually if you pretty much just Google microaggressions or strategies for interrupting microaggressions, you're likely to find some. Some of them might be, and allies oftentimes easier to maybe interrupt, but you could just ask a question. So when you say that, schizophrenics are violent, could you say more about what you mean? I mean, that maybe be sort of a light way maybe to do it. Or you could provide information. In fact, the association between schizophrenia and violence is not particularly well established, and if you control for some certain factors, then in fact it goes away entirely. Providing information. Sometimes humor might be another example to kind of defuse the situation. So there's a number of strategies that can be used.
Thank you. All right, for Steve McDonald, Some universities have policies regarding documentation of illnesses that may violate HIPAA protections. Here, if a student requests rescheduling an exam due to physical illness, if the student has a private doctor, a note documenting that illness is sufficient. But if the student went to the USC Health Center's doctor, this school requires the student to authorize the health center to hand over the student's entire medical history. Okay, now we are being told that this is not correct information.
That is not correct information. In fact, I first heard that myth. I'm sorry. That is not correct information. Somebody mentioned that to me last year, and I asked them to try to track down where that came from. That is not true at this university now.
Okay, so the question was, how do we advocate for that? But it sounds like one way, if there's any misunderstanding, is that they could come and speak with you.
Right. If there's a misunderstanding, there's actually a number of folks on campus they can speak to. But what I think is important here is, now that I'm hearing that for the second time, we have some education we need to do for our student community that we have obviously not done before.
Yeah,
So,
I think the answer to that is not to come speak to her, but to be spoken to by her. That's probably the key. Yes.
To be spoken to by her.
Yes.
Steve, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, first of all, for reasons I'll go into tomorrow, there's actually no HIPAA issue there at all, and that's commonly misunderstood, one of my 3 myths that we'll talk about tomorrow. But I cannot imagine under any set of rules that would apply how that possibly could be legal to require the disclosure of the entire medical file in that circumstance. Nobody needs to know that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. For Jim Price, very quickly, this is a question about a counselor at a community college, and I'll just make it a little bit briefer. The question is, our resources are limited, and how do we make determinations about the level of resource that is devoted to a reasonable accommodation for a disability? In other words, is within the definition of reasonable, is our resources taken into consideration, the amount of resources that we have?
Yeah, and the answer is yes. Reasonable is an accommodation that is bounded by whether or not it creates a fundamental change in the program or causes an undue hardship or burden. And undue hardship or burden includes a fiscal burden. So if the example is somebody who would like to attend a lecture class, but there needs to be an elevator put into the building, that obviously is an undue burden, and you can take into account the resources of the institution. I think for a community college, which is part of the government, to basically talk about having limited resources to provide an accommodation, when the cost of those accommodations, I assume, would be relatively minimal, then I think there's probably going to be a finding in the other direction that it's not an undue burden, and that the accommodation would be not unreasonable because of fiscal concerns. That being said, that the requirement for providing a reasonable accommodation is that you have to provide the assistance the person needs, and if there is something that would be less expensive but equally effective, then the institution is able to bring that up in a dialogue with the person, and hopefully through that interaction arrive at an appropriate accommodation where the student doesn't have to accept something that's cheaper and less effective, but if it's cheaper and equally effective, then that would be an appropriate accommodation.
Okay, Becky, one final thing?
I just want to ask a question about that, because what I'm hearing from students that are requesting, that they get told that this is what their accommodation is. Is there a length of time to test it out to see if it's equally effective, or because I think that they don't get that other piece of the information?
Yeah, no accommodation is permanent in that sense, that any time it becomes apparent that it's not working, then that should be brought to the attention of the institution, and that dialogue should be re-entered to come up with something else that would provide the accommodation that's necessary.
I'm going to move us to our last topic of the morning, and that is really outlining some of the support resources we have. Some of the issues include, we talked a little about the social scene and fitting into the social scene. being like everybody else. And my experience as a counseling center director is there are some students who choose to go off medication that worked for them in high school because they want to be like everybody else. They don't want their roommate to see them taking medication. And they show up at my center at Thanksgiving with some pretty serious concerns. Culture, congruence, and expansion. And I think we got in the last panel, people aren't just one thing. People have many segments of their identity, and they're intersecting and they're fluid. And what is salient at the moment is often what the environment is pulling out to be salient. And often those intersecting identities are not in agreement with each other. Learning to manage that as you adjust to college is an issue. Managing time, managing stress, managing self-care. Someone talked to you when you mentioned where to get their laundry done, the idea that they actually have to do their own laundry, whether they're male or female. My nephew, who has no disability, showed up at Thanksgiving in Ohio with a tank top and shorts to go to Thanksgiving dinner with his grandmother, and I'm like, you don't have any clean clothes, do you, Andy? And he said, nope. I said, you brought your laundry for me to do. He said, yep. I said, I'm going to show you how to use a washing machine. So the whole self-care, self-independence is also part of adjusting to college. And when you're adjusting with a disability, it's squared and sometimes cubed. So I'd like to hear a little bit about the support resources we have in place to really support our students in that adjustment to be successful in academic. I think Kent's going to do the lead comment. Then we're going to hear from psychological services, psychiatric services, and academic support.
Well, you know, we heard earlier this afternoon about the fact that there's so much more to university life than the simple sum of courses and credit hours that we take for a degree, and it couldn't be more true. And we also often hear the homily that universities are places that celebrate and communicate the life of the mind. And it seems to me in order to do that, you need to worry about the health of the mind. And so at Cornell, over the last probably 20 years, there's been a major effort to educate the community broadly around these issues related to mental health. And it starts with the president on the first day of orientation, goes through things like tapestry and other things. There are a whole host of other support services that are offered, but fundamentally it's about educating the whole community such that students who are not themselves will come to the attention of some member of that community, whether it's faculty, staff, students. I would also add families, because I think families oftentimes know an awful lot more about their students' lives than they're likely to admit prior to admissions, but we would invite them to disclose post-admissions. And as I said, we like to think of them as partners in this enterprise. I have discovered that there are families who have fraught relationships with their children, but they're in the substantial minority. Most families are loving of their children and want to help, and when they're invited to assist in ways that are entirely selfless. So the idea is basically, since these illnesses often present in college-age students, to find ways and means to get students to help for treatment, diagnosis, and most importantly, while they're in university, teach them how to manage their illnesses such that they can complete their undergraduate or graduate degree programs. And then, of course, most importantly, go on to have productive lives beyond university. And from my point of view, and I think I speak on behalf of our institution, we think we can make an enormous contribution to the national public health if not only we could do it, but universities across the country could do it. So, I guess I'm here to hope that perhaps we might think about a way in which that might happen. I understand that Gatekeepers is an organization that does that, but maybe there needs to be more. You can imagine how important it would be if universities really had the resources and could take this up as an important part of what they do as an institution for higher education. It's not just about the life of the mind, it's about the health of the mind.
Okay, thank you. Eileen, do you want to talk about counseling psychological services?
Sure. across the nation, there's a whole bunch of different models that exist, from people who just see someone quickly to refer out or do more academic focus, all the way up to units that have really a full continuum of care. And what do I mean by that? They may have the ability to commit people. They may have inpatient, which is kind of an infirmary or a memo of understanding with a hospital of how to get someone in and out quickly and be part of disposition meetings, all the way down to individual counseling, group counseling, family counseling. And I do want to emphasize the family a little bit too, because families often don't know how to be helpful. They want to be helpful, and it's very, a lot of major mental health illnesses happen during young adulthood at the first incident, and so helping families to understand what's going on with my son or daughter is also really important and part of the psychological services that we offer, because it really does take a community to help students who are challenged with mental health concerns. And it's not just the counseling center. I have to say, we are the prime place to look at in terms of treatment, prevention, those kind of things. But this is a real partnership. We have a partnership with our public safety. I think we have a partnership with student affairs, with our residential life. I mean, it really is a joint model, and that's what I'm seeing across the country, is that it's real collaboration, and that yes, we're the place for treatment and assessment. I also want to mention something about judicial. We've had no conversation yet about student judicial, and oftentimes many of our students have done behaviors that may go out of the realm of what's acceptable or appropriate behavior by the code of conduct, etc., at our university. This is a real important partnership that we have with judicial in terms of really understanding how to help somebody. What happens if someone's in a manic state, does these things? Do we forgive? You know, is that okay? What, you know, how do we handle those kind of places? So again, I think as someone said, we're an educational unit, and this is a real age of learning, so supporting that. And we see that counseling service is one of those major players in terms of looking and helping people to understand what are the systems that support students, that are healthy, that help all students, and then specifically students with mental health challenges.
Just want to extend that, and it's probably common of other places, but it was new to me. We have a committee that meets once a week that involves campus police, judicial administrator, dean of students, crisis managers, sometimes academic advisors, folks from counseling services, but also another team that we call, I never know the acronym, CCI. It's the psychologists that actually work with a layperson like myself or a faculty member to empower me to be a good citizen in helping a student. So they're kind of those in-between troubleshooters. They'll leave their office and come out and meet with us and just help us to think in broader ways. But I think that cross-section piece, especially with the police and the JA, is handling confidential information for sure, and there's some concerns around that, but can we see it through this wide, it's improved everybody's ability to see it in a broad way.
And
really
we'll be
helpful.
expanding the resources available when things are not going so well in the second half, just as a teaser to come back. That consultation focus, though, that ability to work with a faculty who's not sure what to do, maybe they come with the best intent, maybe they're really coming for the psychological police to get this person out of my space, but helping them look at how they can empower. Before I go back there, I'm going to go to Timothy and talk about psychiatric resources.
So the psychiatrist...
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, Timothy Pateo.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Talk and see if the mic comes up.
Timothy Pateo, can you hear me? I'm the
There it is.
there we go.
clinical professor.
Stand up.
Okay.
Can't be seen.
Can't be seen, sorry. I'll stand right behind Tim here. And Becky. I'm the psychiatrist on the panel. I work at LA County USC Medical Center and do mostly inpatient work. So the psychiatrist, when the student comes to see a psychiatrist, it's trying to develop a partnership with the student to realize the situation they're in and to try to assess the problem, the diagnosis, and to see if medication is required. Most of the talk therapy and other issues have been tried and failed before they come to see a psychiatrist. I notice that some of our patients, just in general, have a lot of substance abuse problems too, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but that complicates and also independent variable. There's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of street drugs going on, marijuana, which complicates their thinking, concentration, sleep habits, and just their own personal well-being, and sometimes that has to be addressed. And then there's also some medical issues. Got to make sure that the student is well physically, because some of these medical problems can exacerbate their mental status. I think the outpatient psychiatrist is trying to partner with the student to try to make sure if they prescribe their medication, that they are compliant with it, and then also to get them to navigate through the academic stresses. I've had patients who've been in hospitals, they were in school, they're in hospital, they get hospitalized, and then they come back out and try to start school up again, and they have to manage their stress and try to figure out how much they can handle, and that's kind of a tricky barometer that they have to figure out, that we have to figure out together, because their symptoms may increase as the stress of academic life increases. And so having social support and having roommates, families, to help them see what's going on is a great help.
Okay. Jim, I think you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, well, it's actually a question. When psychological services, we're talking about partnership with public safety, and thinking back to our earlier conversation about how difficult it is for somebody to decide to disclose and seek help. I'm just wondering if you could address a little bit that question, or maybe there's another place in the program, I don't know, of how do we deal with making your services readily available to people who want and need to use them without the feeling like they're going to walk in the door and they're going to be kicked out of school because we're afraid that they're going to do something and we're going to send them home.
So one of the things in terms of fear, that is, we do have a subpopulation of people who are afraid of that very much. That what does it mean if I disclose even to professional? Will I be immediately? So it's real important that you follow the confidentiality rules of the state that you're in, you know, that's there, and that's in your materials, so that before someone even gets any services, it's really spelled out. When would confidentiality be broken? When would this be, you know, in terms of that? And sometimes that could be the beginning of the first session, is really to make the person feel like, what is this about? How does that work? There are times, though, that our front line is a Department of Public Safety officer. An example of that, someone's in the Lions Center, which is our exercise facility, and is in a corner crying in a ball. And so people call, you know, the public safety. And again, it's the sensitivity of a whole community of, it sounds funny, but getting down on the floor with the person, talking to them. And I've seen this time and time again of numerous good citizens, I think you called, of the campus, who do this work day in, day out, and if it's done in that caring way. So we had a student who wanted to go to the hospital. DPS was going to drive them there, but he was hungry, and I thought it was fabulous. The officer stopped at Wendy's to get him a sandwich because he hadn't eaten. And so when I went to visit him in the hospital, what he said to me was, "This has been surprisingly an enjoyable experience." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they cared enough to stop the car. We all went out and they bought my sandwich. You know, I mean, we all had lunch together, and then we went over to the hospital." So that's the kind of level of care that is really saying something. And these people didn't get a training on how to do this. They just used their guts on what was appropriate, that it was safe enough to do this, that it was appropriate enough to do this. So going back to your question, I think it's also the stories that other people, and being transparent. So having panels of students who have been through this experience to say, this helped me. That something that I was petrified, going to a hospital, petrified, actually turned out to be one of the best moves in my life. And that's why I appreciate even this symposium where we have students talking about their experience. It's just key.
And certainly we'll get to, in the second half, the hospital is not always a pleasant experience, so really thinking about what are the reasons to do that. But I want to follow up here first with, John, would you like to introduce yourself since we talked about public safety?
Yes, hopefully my mic is picking up. It sounds like it is. I'm John Thomas. I'm the chief of the Department of Public Safety.
Chief Thomas, would you maybe like to stand up?
And I am standing up. I've heard that joke before. But back to what Eileen was saying, as public safety and law enforcement, we have to be a part of the collaborative mindset and mission. We don't, once we do our part, we don't get to divest ourselves from being just as compassionate, just as caring, and just as affirmative as the other partnership that we're plugged into. So it does not surprise me, because I expect that of my officers, that when they do have to respond to these situations, that these are treated along the same line and are consistent with the values of the partnership as we meet and partner with counseling services and student affairs and the other partnerships in the university. Our role is to get in lockstep and be just as consistent and just as caring and compassionate.
And I want to put in a plea for CIT training for any of your officers. It really makes a difference in terms of the officers who are really trained to recognize when someone is some kind of mental health crisis and how to approach them in a way that is going to be helpful and not stimulate more fear and not be controlling. And that means for those of you on campuses, not just your campus, but often these events may be happening off campus in your community. So it's looking at your community police force and who of them are CIT trained, because that's who you want to call for kinds of things when we go this afternoon. Heather, you had a comment.
It was more of a question. So it kind of, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Eileen.
Eileen. It sounds like a lot of what ameliorates a lot of what could possibly happen is just humanity, right? Like compassion and caring and relationships. So I know that we're concerned about what do we do in terms of policy, what do we do at the level of systems, but then it seems like a large part of this is cultural and orientation, right? So how do we create cultures where if somebody sees somebody curled up in a ball someplace, that they feel empowered, that they feel safe, that they feel like it's appropriate to just go ask what's going on, right? So how do we build communities of care, perhaps, where it's not always, well, let me go look in the policy manual to see how we're supposed to deal with this. How do we create systems that do have policies but do leave room for exceptions to be made where exceptional circumstances warrant those types of responses?
Mm-hmm. Becky, I think you had a comment.
So I had a couple of things that crossed my mind. One is that I've not really heard discussed, but is the issue, again, around disclosure. And when people are experiencing distress, how do we choose to talk about that? Basically, what we currently use is a one-size-fits-all with a general release of information statement. Now, I don't know about all of you, but if I asked you to write me a blank check, would you?
I would.
Okay. I'll take you up on that.
I think she'll take it.
May we
Her name is
speak to
Becky
you
Child.
after the program?
But the same is true in terms of the relationships and some of the challenges we have with our families and kind of the separation that goes on with college-age students. and that is, what do we want disclosed? I really don't want you telling them that I'm on birth control or something like that. I mean, that was an issue that got, in some other situation, that was addressed. And I'm like, well, what did that have to do with the crisis, A? But B, so where is the concern regarding the disclosure? And so maybe being proactive in how we ask people about what they want disclosed, how would they like it disclosed, to whom do they want? Maybe I want my mother told, but not my father. Some different things like that. Or maybe it's my father and not my mother. It could be. Or it could be none of those things, but to have some choice. And when we use that one-size-fits-all release of information statement, I'm just really uncomfortable with that because I don't have a sense of control over about what's being disclosed.
Right. And I think a good disclosure statement has to whom, for what are the restrictions, and what's the time frame. And we shouldn't be using any...
But it's more than that, though. I mean, it's more about, so if I'm having distress, what does that mean? And what does it look like when I have distress? And what should I tell people about that? It's a conversation. And what I tell people in the behavioral health community is just because somebody's having conflict with their family members or their loved ones today doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. People change. Relationships change over time. And even ones that you think are never going to change may change sometime. And so kind of revisiting that conversation, saying, well, if you were my kid, I'd be really worried about you. Can you put yourself in my shoes as your parent? What do you want me to know? Tell me something, or just tell me, okay, this is my diagnosis, and or tell me about how people get better. Some really specific things like that. It's more than just those specific things, but there's more. There's a culture to it.
It is now time for our break. We will reconvene at 5.
Before we break, we have one person, I'm sorry. We have, Lynette's not going to be able to come back. And at the end, I was going to add, I'm sorry, anyone who's on the panel at the end, I wanted them to leave us with one sentence if there was anything they wanted you to know. So anyone who's not going to be able to come back? One sentence. You have a sentence?
Everybody has to come
Catherine, do you have a sentence? Nope. Not your sentence. I'm sorry. It was. No, she's.
I would just say that. We obviously have tremendous resources up here. I would say take the next second half of today and tomorrow, and if you have individual questions and want to have conversations about processes, or if there are things that we can maybe have a conversation to help improve, if you think we can improve, please do that and take advantage of that. I'm learning a lot today. I took a lot of notes from up here that I'm going to talk to my colleagues about at the university to see, are we doing this? Are we making the maximum effort in this area? And I would hope that people would come up to me tomorrow if they have questions, concerns, and we can talk through it.
Now, Steve.
We will reconvene at 5 minutes until 4.
Thank you.